Today, let me introduce you to three African ministers. Their respective names are Mamadou, Pedro, and Tshepo. Mamadou is the Minister of Transport, Pedro is the Minister of Housing, and Tshepo is the Minister of Energy. You will agree with me that these are very important and powerful men. They are important and powerful not because they are ministers, but because in addition to being ministers, they are also heading and overseeing very strategic sectors, of their country. It is safe to say that transport, housing, and energy, among other sectors, are actually very detrimental to the day-to-day life of a country, but also to the economic growth and the development growth of any country in the world. So if you happen to become a minister responsible for one of these very important, economic sector, you'll certainly be someone who's very influential. And this is actually the case of my three fellow ministers, or my three friends, if I could put it that way, Mamadou, Pedro, and Tshepo. But what's interesting with these three ministers is that they've been in power, or in office actually. I'm not going to say in power because it's more applicable to a president than to a minister. So they've been in office for the last 10 years, and they've been trying their best with whatever budget, whatever finance, at their disposal. They've been trying, to foster the development agenda within their specific minister. They've been trying to also seek for other opportunities to have access to finance. And I've had the opportunity to discuss with Mamadou, Pedro, and Tshepo. And when I asked them a very logical and a very rational question as to try and understand what's the current state, of development within their specific industry, they said to me that, unfortunately, since their country gained independence in the 60s, and today in 2025, the transport sectors is not faring well. In terms of housing, it's even worse. Over 90% of the population, and we're talking about households with modest income, do not have access to decent housing. When I asked Mr. Tshepo about the state of energy, he said the country is experiencing load shedding at least once or twice a week, and I'm being very generous here. So overall, what they said to me is that it's very difficult, to put their country on the right path when it comes to public infrastructure, when it comes to access to development infrastructure, because they do not have access to finance. Access to finance is becoming very critical. Access to finance is becoming very difficult. And lastly, access to finance is becoming very costly. And I sat down for a couple of seconds and I tried to reflect upon the intelligence they just provided me with. And after that, I tried and asked them another very interesting question. I said, well, perhaps your argument and your reasons are valid. They make sense. But what can you tell me in terms of your current achievement? What have you been able to achieve despite this constraining environment when it comes to access to finance? The answer was almost the same. They started talking about the hardship, the difficulties around managing such key industries. They started talking about the difficulties when accessing finance again, which somehow, has a direct and a negative impact when it comes to assessing, their performance as minister in charge of a specific industry for at least 10 years. So I decided to take upon myself, this very interesting initiative and also try and look at whether what they were saying makes sense and whether this is actually like a valid and a solid argument to justify their underperformance and to also justify the underdevelopment of their country that actually gained independence since 1960 and which has been, undertaking international loans and gaining access to international grants, international, investment within transport, housing, energy. Of course, there are other economic sectors of their nation where foreign investment, was dispersed. But for sake of argument, I'm just going to stick at these key sectors that I just mentioned, and I'll try to look at what could possibly be the reason why, despite having access to international credit, despite having access to international donors' money, to international financing and funding, key economic sectors like transport, housing, energy, education, health are still facing challenges to take off. It's very difficult for most African countries to fare well when it comes to these sectors. Even when you take the most advanced African economies, such as South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, there's still a lot to do. But of course, they are, with the exclusion of Nigeria, I'd say South Africa and Nigeria are currently or perhaps at a better level when it comes to education and health compared to Nigeria. But like I say, let's take a look at what Mamadou, Tshepo, and Pedro just shared with me. And also for the record, as you definitely know, these are for the sake of argument. These people do not exist, but I just made them up to make this episode more vibrant and to, stimulate the conversation. Welcome to your favorite development podcast, Smart, Intellectual, Knowledgeable African Talks. My name is S.I.K.A, and I'm the host, the main host actually, and the producer of this podcast. If this is your first time listening to S.I.K.A Talks, well, this podcast, like I said, is created to discuss development, politics, and environment topics so long as they're related to the African continent. My objective here is to make, this kind of topic interesting, vibrant, and trending among young African intellectuals in particular, and also among people who share a strong and a deep passion for Africa's development. Now, you will remember that from the introduction, Mamadou, Pedro, and Tshepo were trying to explain that the reason why their country is not that developed when it comes to transport, housing, and energy is because they do not have access to finance. In other terms, what they're trying to highlight here is the difficulty around having enough money to actually start developing and implementing their development project. What they're trying to highlight here is how challenging it is for their government to implement whatever public project they have in their specific minister. And the main argument is not lack of technical capacities. It is not lack of human capital. It is not lack of even government will. But what they're trying to promote and to pretend here is that they may have already all the tools, but there's one key missing tool, which is access to finance, which is actually money to fuel the project, to actually kickstart the project. And if you don't go deeper, you may be tempted to say that they're right. You may be tempted to say that, whatever they're saying here, especially what they're saying right now, makes sense. It's very difficult, of course, for you to start a public project because public projects are very expensive. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars at a minimum, and sometimes we're talking about like several $billion. For instance, if you want to develop or to build an oil refinery, you have to spend a minimum of like $15 to $25 billion. That's the minimum. If you want to also develop and build a cocoa manufacturer or a cocoa refinery where you're going to transform your cocoa production or coffee production, you're looking at $100 billion. So these projects are costly. If you're also looking at, building like a bridge, and try and connect, two cities or connect some places, within your specific country, you're also looking at, several, $billion, a minimum of like 10 to $20 billion, to build a bridge, a proper one, a one that's going to be sustainable, that's going to be environmental friendly, and a bridge that is also going to like tick all the international standards when it comes to protection, environment, and stuff like that. So again, this project costs a lot of money. And when we look at the national GDP of some African countries, it's very difficult for African government to actually secure a percentage of their revenue towards, developing or investing, themselves in such costly project. So what they do most of the time, Mamadou, Pedro, and Tshepo as minister, what they do have the technical knowledge, and they do have, the signature. The signature is the international reputation. You have the credibility. Your country may actually enjoy a very interesting international image. Your country has a good signature, among international organizations, among international investors, and among international donors, because your country is actually known for making timely payment, and it's also known for making good in terms of their financial commitment. So what Mamadou and Pedro and Tshepo will actually do, or what they do more often, is that they go on out there and they apply for loans. They apply for project finance. And they usually do their application through the World Bank, the IMF, or any other international development bank or international, investors and donors community out there. And they have access to finance. They have access to investment. They have access to, whatever funding they need to actually kickstart the project. So you will agree with me that Mamadou, Pedro, and Tshepo, when they're doing so, they actually apply for international finance. They apply for international credit based on the concrete fact that they will start a project, based on the concrete. And again, I use the term concrete because I'm talking about an existing project. We're not talking about a project, that does not exist. The project must exist on paper. The project must be conceptualized. The project must be designed. So the project is there. It may have not started yet, but the project exists on paper. The project meets all the international requirements, from the financial conception to the consideration of social and environmental impact and stuff like that. So the project does exist. And what Mamadou, Pedro, and Tshepo will usually do is that they will actually create a task force which is going to be responsible for making sure that they are going to liaise with the international bank or the financial community, the international financial community, to make sure that they will raise the proper amount of capital needed to kickstart the project. And based on this structure, what I want you to keep in mind is that when discussing with Mamadou, Pedro, and Tshepo, their main argument was to tell me that the reason why their countries are actually not developed or have not yet reached an optimal level of development in transport, housing, and energy, it's because they do not have access to finance. But if you take the record, for the last 50 to 60 years, you will notice one thing. All African countries benefited from international financing for the last 50 years. And you need to understand that when the World Bank, the IMF, when any international financial institution gives you money, they give you money under the pretense that you are going to develop or to start or to kickstart a public project, a public infrastructure project. Those organizations never finance the private sector. Well, what I mean by that is that if your country, goes and apply for a loan on behalf of the private sector, it will be very difficult. But if the objective is to actually create a project, that's going to be paid back by taxpayers' money, that's going to be paid back by, the government. Well, and the project will obviously benefit not just a private entity, but will benefit everyone in the country, will have also direct and indirect impact within a specific industry, but within also, the surrounding economy and the surrounding ecosystem. Definitely, you will actually get the finance, save that you also meet their internal requirement. So what I want you to keep in mind is that there's no such a thing that access to money is very difficult when it comes to the development of project. What I want you to keep in mind is that there is another reason. There is another very plausible reason, another very realistic reason why, since 1960 up to 2025, many African countries still lags behind when it comes to public infrastructure in transport, in housing, in energy, in health, in education, and in many other key economic sector. And if you are curious, I'll invite you to stay tuned for part 2, where I will be discussing more and I will go deeper in my analysis. I will tell you that if access to finance, in my opinion, is not a problem, what can the problem be? Do you have an idea? Well, do not hesitate to drop me your perception in the comment section. You can tell me what you think of, if, in your opinion, access to finance is not a problem, what other things can you spot? Thank you for your time. Thank you for supporting and listening to your favorite development and political podcast. If you like this episode, do not forget to drop a like, to also drop a comment, and to share it with your community, your friends, and stay tuned for part 2. I promise it will be very amazing and very interesting. We will try and find out why Mamadou, Pedro and Tshepo, have not been able to deliver according to their development goals. Thank you and à bientôt.